Hi, I'm Mr. Wahlberg, and I'm glad you're here. All of the turmoil of the progressive era, all of the upheaval of the war years, all of the big asks and sacrifices that Americans were making, and the social chaos that seemed to be swimming in them, it made Americans hungry for a sense of normalcy. The kind of normalcy that Warren G. Harding was promising in his presidency. To go, maybe to borrow and use another term, to make politics boring again. It's a delightful story. So, dear students, incline your ear and hear our stories so that you might find your place among his delights. We have three objectives today. By the end of this class, you should be able to contrast Harding's policy of normalcy with progressive era reforms. You should be able to characterize the governing approach and the limits of the Harding administration, and you should be able to describe the presidential goals and the outcomes of Calvin Coolidge. But let's begin in Roman numeral number 4. Here we see Harding approaching the world to understand how maybe Wilson's vision is going to be carried out or not carried out, but how to secure lasting peace, but also America's role into it. Because after the Great War, the United States faced international problems with things like arms control and war debts and the war-torn countries of Europe. To settle these problems, Harding hosted the Washington Naval Conference, inviting all of the world's major powers, except Communist Russia, but to Washington, D.C. to go see what the future of naval power might look like. At that conference, the Secretary of State, a guy named Charles Evans Hughes, he proposed a significant disarmament. He said maybe the countries of the world should stop building warships for at least a decade, and that the world's biggest naval powers actually even decommission their largest warships and scale down the size of the Navy. Besides the United States, Great Britain, Japan, France, and Italy all agreed to cut their fleets. Conference delegates cried and cheered with the promise and optimism for the future. And then in 1928, we passed another law known as the Kellogg-Briand Pact, which renounced war as a policy among its member countries. It was a pact like a treaty between countries who all agreed that they're just not going to go to war anymore. There wasn't really any way to enforce this pact, of course, and so it was futile. Subpoint B, Great Britain and France owed a lot of money to the United States. They owed around $10 billion in wartime loans, and that's $1 billion in 1920s dollars. And it was paid for. They were going to pay back that debt to the United States by selling goods to the United States or by collecting reparations from Germany, because Germany had a large reparations payment to make out of the Treaty of Versailles. The Fordney-McCumber tariff, though, raised taxes on U.S. imports to 60%. So essentially, Harding wants to go protect American businesses, and the way he does that is through a tariff system. We've talked a few times about how the tariffs actually are sort of a complicated deal, and they don't always pan out the way that they expect to. But that's what happened with the Fordney-McCumber tariff. So 60% tariff, and it was the highest tariff we'd ever put on imports. The tax protected U.S. businesses from foreign competition. It basically made all imported goods look really, really more expensive. But it also meant that Great Britain and France, who were relying on exporting to the United States, relying on that to go pay back the tariffs, meant that they really couldn't repay their debts. That prompted Great Britain and France to go step up their collections from Germany, saying, okay, Germany, we need you to go make these reparations payments. But Germany was facing its own problems, inflation problems, and it was ultimately unable to pay back France. Germany defaulted on those loans, and France said, okay, well, or not loans, but defaulted on those payments. And France said, okay, well, if you can't make your payments this way, then we'll make your payments some other way. And then started seizing German land to go, make it now French land. And all of a sudden that leads to fears of resparking war. And now France is taking land from Germany. What if Germany wants to go defend that land? To avoid this, what seemed like a looming war, the United States banker, a guy named Charles Dawes, was sent to go negotiate loans to Germany. Said, okay, maybe here Germany is the one that needs bailing out right now. So the Dawes plan loaned $5.2 billion to Germany to go pay their reparations payments back to France and Great Britain. And then France and Great Britain could take those reparations payments and go pay back the United States the money that they owed from before World War I. It basically takes American money, loans it to the Germans, who pays it to the French and British, who will pay it to Americans, and we essentially start repaying, getting the debts repaid with our own money. And all sides resented the deal. Everybody kind of hates this plan, but it's the plan that was carried through. Britain and France said that the United States wasn't helping pay for the costs of World War I, yet they seem to be profiting off of the expenses of World War I that cost Europeans millions of dollars and lives. And the United States said, hey, we're repaying money with our own money, and maybe France and Great Britain, maybe you guys are the ones that are being financially irresponsible in this. Roman numeral number 5. All right, so let's talk about Harding's leadership at home. And I think we might characterize Harding's leadership as a laissez-faire kind of leadership. Laissez-faire, it's a French term that essentially means let it be, just hands off. Let the economy run like it's going to run, let laws keep a light touch, laissez-faire. And Harding really favored this approach. He wanted a smaller and less controlling model of government. It would be reluctant to interfere in business and in social life. It was a sharp change from the progressive era that thought the government should be involved in everything. He set up the Bureau of the Budget to go help the government run efficiently and to limit any wasteful spending that would come up. He thought that government should largely stay out of the way of business, and unless something really needs to be regulated, keep the government out of business regulation. But he did use the persuasive power of the presidency to go urge U.S. Steel to go stop their 12-hour workdays. They, in an effort to go avoid a future steel strike, Harding doesn't, issue it as an executive order or a law, but he does, basically, with the power of the White House, go and strong-arm U.S. Steel into cutting back on their workdays. Subpoint B. Here I want to introduce Charles Evans Hughes. So we talked to him very briefly about his role in the Washington Naval Conference. He would later go and serve as Chief Justice of the Supreme Court of the United States. Charles Evans Hughes is a pretty important person that a lot of us moderns don't really know that well. So he's Charles Evans Hughes, and he is really a respected person in the Harding cabinet. Harding he did a nice job of putting really competent people in some important positions. Take Hughes. You've also got Herbert Hoover. Herbert Hoover was the masterful mining engineer who became the engineer of food relief to keep Europe from starving in all the turmoil of World War I. And then afterwards, he set up a European Relief Council that sent food to Europe to keep them from just falling into famine. And he did it all with contributions. There wasn't any taxpayer support that went into it, helping refugees and hungry people. And really, Hoover, approaching this with an engineer scientific mindset did, I think everybody says, masterful work in keeping a continent from falling into just starvation and chaos. So Harding appoints Hoover to a new job, the leader of the Secretary of Commerce. Hoover utilized the Commerce Department to go create 2,000 trade associations, which would represent countries in almost every major industry, to go help these companies work together to improve their product and improve their working conditions and their production capacity and be more efficient. And that's really a product of the Hoover's oversight of the Department of Commerce. Government officials worked very closely with these associations, providing statistical research and suggesting industry-wide standards so all of the pieces might, work together better. But also, promoting stable prices and stable wages, thinking that if workers are working in the manufacturing industry, they shouldn't expect, crazy fluctuations all the time, that, people need to know how much money they're going to make. Hoover hoped that through voluntary business cooperation, that businesses and government, not by forcing them like a progressive era, but through a voluntary cooperation, you could have this what he called his associated state. He could achieve what the progressive reformers really wanted, improving working conditions and, the rising tide lifts all the boats, right? Hoover thought that he could do that without, forcing it through government to go do so. Bolstered by, and then the next person I want you to meet is Andrew Mellon. Andrew Mellon, fantastically rich banker and investment advisor. He's he's one of the richest people in America, and Harding appoints Mellon to go be the Secretary of the Treasury. Honestly, what Mellon does, Secretary of Treasury, looks like black magic, like he's doing wizardry. He's able to preside over a growing economy, a strong international market, and he does so while Mellon says we can advocate cutting taxes. Yet with that growing economy, the lower taxes, but still able to go reduce the national debt. So like to lower the tax burden on Americans, but also to lower the debt burden on the United States. And it looks like Andrew Mellon is just like takes a staff and stomps it on the ground and makes magic happen. So point C. But Harding also appoints a number of scoundrels. And this is kind of the thing that dogs the Harding administration. When Harding came to Washington, D.C., he brought with him basically a group of advisors from his old Ohio sort of circle of friends and advisors that he brings to Washington, D.C., and they're far less reputable. They become known as the Ohio Gang, and they're not, competent bureaucrats that come from the system. They're like his buddies. And the Ohio Gangs, they were politicians and industry leaders that he met while Harding was a state politician. During the Harding administration, members of the Ohio Gang became involved in several financial scandals, and like I said, this kind of tarnishes the reputation of the Harding administration today. They used their positions in government to become wealthy through what's known as graft. We've used this term before when we used it back in the Gilded Age. And that's where, like somebody has a government position and they start selling its influence and taking kickbacks of money. They're using a government job for political or financial gain. Harding, in Harding's defense, he probably didn't have direct knowledge of what's going on there. He probably didn't exactly know that the graft was happening the way it is. However, he does carry the responsibility that he appoints these people to their position, and maybe if he's not providing the kind of oversight that would have opened these things up, then he carries the burden for these corrupt politicians. The next thing that maybe the biggest example of it is a scandal known as Teapot Dome. The biggest scandal was that of Teapot Dome, a resource-rich area of central Wyoming. So there's kind of a rock formation that looked like a teapot and is sort of, like a dome shape, more or less, known as Teapot Dome. And it's in central Wyoming. And there, the Secretary of the Interior, so kind of Washington, D.C. bureaucracy, the Secretary of Interior takes care of the stuff inside the country and more or less manages the natural resources and the national parks and stuff, and in a totally perfectly Washington, D.C. way, the Department of Interior manages things that are outside in the exterior, but interior of the country. Anyway, Albert Fall was the Secretary of Interior, and he had the control of Teapot Dome moved from the Navy Department, who had been using it for mining oil and petroleum to go, power the Navy, moved it from the Navy Department to the Department of Interior, saying like, hey, this is inside the country and this should be managing for American resources, not just Navy resources. Here's the kicker, though, is that Albert Fall, while that's a totally legitimate move to do, Albert Fall was like buddies with these oil executives who were in the petroleum business, and then suddenly all of them get these great, lucrative contracts to go mine oil on American land, on publicly owned land, and then Albert Fall was probably taking kickbacks to do it. He took $400,000 worth of kickbacks, and Albert Fall gets caught on it. He's arrested and taken to trial. He's actually convicted of a felony for this action, and he does it while serving in the U.S. cabinet. He doesn't resign and he doesn't get fired from it. He becomes the first cabinet member to be convicted of a felony while serving in the cabinet. While investigating Teapot Dome, the United States Senate uncovered a kickback program reaching all the way up to the Attorney General. So the Attorney General is like, I know it says attorney and it makes it sound like he's a lawyer, but the Attorney General is actually the head cop of America. He's the head of the Justice Department. And find out this kickback program is reaching all the way up to the Justice Department and the Attorney General. There, he was receiving payments for non-enforcement of bootlegging laws during Prohibition. So it's the Prohibition era, and you have the Secretary, the Attorney General, the head cop, is not enforcing bootlegging laws because he's taking kickbacks from distillers. A key witness in this investigation also just suddenly committed suicide during the investigation. There was also a scandal that uncovered, including of Colonel Thomas Miller. So Thomas Miller, Colonel Miller, was the head of the Office of Alien Property, which doesn't mean like from aliens, like UFOs, but more like the Customs Office. And there he was caught taking a bribe to allow the assets of a German industrial company to like import goods to the United States illegally, and that, Colonel Miller's just going to ignore it because he's head of the alien property, and he's taking a kickback to go do that as well. So, the Ohio gang, these scoundrels of the Harding administration, that's really, I think, how most people remember it. There's also this issue of the Veterans Bureau, where Charles Forbes, who was head of the Veterans Bureau, he got caught taking bribes from construction contracts to go build all these new veterans hospitals. And we had a lot of veterans coming out of World War I, and they get VA protections and to go build all these new veterans hospitals to go care for the returning troops who were coming home. He also illegally sold stockpiles of expensive hospital supplies to insiders, so he's like selling VA stuff to his buddies. And when it was discovered, Forbes just absconded. He just went off to Europe. He escaped to Europe. And a key witness to the trial, like before they could go get him back and put it in trial, a key witness, just like with the Justice Department, committed suicide before he could testify. There, Charles Forbes later returned to the United States, and he was arrested and tried and convicted and spent time in jail. Subpoint D. All of these scandals were popping up, they came in rapid succession, just like all of this stuff felt like dominoes. And Warren G. Harding really struggled to understand how to handle this news, how to deal with it, how to go approach it, and it all kind of came at one time. In summer of 1923, he commented, he says, "I've got no trouble with my enemies." And Harding was a politician. He'd had political enemies. He said, "I have no problem with my enemies. It's my friends. My friends are the ones that keep me walking the floor at nights." A few weeks later, on August 2nd in 1923, sick with the stress of the scandal, Harding died suddenly of a heart attack or maybe a stroke. The medicine at the time wasn't really clear, maybe a combination of the both. Harding died in the moment as an enormously popular president who was beginning the return to what we might call the Roaring Twenties. He restored a sense of normalcy to the turmoil of the Wilson years, but he inherited an economy in transition, who, after years of government control and stagnation, turned it into the Roaring Twenties. But Harding also died just as his administration scandals were coming to light, and so it tarnished his reputation. A lot of times presidents leave office, or they, have scandals, but they stay in office long enough to fix the scandals or live long enough to go repair their legacy. But Harding doesn't do that. He basically dies in the worst moment for his long-term rep. Following Harding's sudden death in 1923, many members of the Ohio gang were effectively removed from the corridors of power by Harding's vice president and successor, Calvin Coolidge. And that brings us to Roman numeral number 6. Calvin Coolidge gets the nickname Silent Cal because he's sort of a recalcitrant man. He just doesn't talk a lot. He's an introvert. He's just kind of a man of few words. He's very un-Roaring Twenties. So much of the Roaring Twenties are about ostentatious showing off of your wealth and your freedom and your excitement and kind of big fronting to people, putting out how awesome you are. That's sort of the ethos of the 1920s. Calvin Coolidge was exactly the opposite. He was quiet and understated. He had a very dry sense of humor. Silent Cal was from Vermont. He had this reputation of sort of Yankee honesty and just kind of a man of the woods and solid American upbringing. He restored confidence to the White House after those series of the scandals of the Harding administration. Subpoint B. President Calvin Coolidge, like Harding, favored a very minimal government interference in business. This policy allowed private enterprise to go flourish during his administration, and it led to the economic growth of the Roaring Twenties. High tariffs helped American manufacturers, while wages and productivity were on the rise. Calvin Coolidge, he keeps some pieces of the Harding administration and then adjusts some other ones. He kept Andrew Mellon in charge of the Department of Treasury, who continued that policy of low taxes, but while making major contributions to the national debt. Coolidge actually kept a lot of Harding's cabinet in place, including some from the Harding-era scandals, but Coolidge provided much stronger oversight, and it prevented any future scandals, and we don't really have any of those dogging America during the Coolidge age. Coolidge only gave one State of the Union address, and that's kind of typical for Silent Cal. He just doesn't like making big speeches or big presentations. In his only State of the Union address in 1923, he called for greater civil rights protections for African Americans, saying that African American rights were just as sacred as those of any other citizen. Under the U.S. Constitution, it said it was a public and a private duty to respect those rights. Coolidge refused to appoint any KKK members to office, despite the fact that the Klan had a considerable, political influence right there. Coolidge is also the guy that grants United States citizenship to Native Americans and argues for protections to immigrants who faced prejudice after arriving to the United States. He appointed the first woman to the federal judiciary, naming Genevieve Klein to the United States Customs Court. Subpoint D. And then Coolidge's son suddenly dies in 1924 from blood poisoning he got from a minor accident playing with his brother. And Calvin Coolidge often unfairly blamed himself for Calvin Jr.'s death. And kind of, I think, when Cal Jr. dies, the old man, Calvin Sr., sunk into a prolonged depression that he just really couldn't shake. In the summer of 1927, while vacationing in the Black Hills of South Dakota, he called an impromptu press conference. Calvin Coolidge loved vacationing, in places like South Dakota. He was off by himself. He could go horseback riding and fly fishing and just kind of be alone for a while. It was kind of his happy place to go be. But he calls this impromptu press conference in the Black Hills, South Dakota, and they get whatever press is around in South Dakota. It wasn't like today where a whole press corps will just follow the president wherever they do. I mean, there was some national press, but kind of it was whoever was around. But he calls them into this lodge in South Dakota, and he hands each one of the reporters a slip of paper, and the slip of paper reads, "I do not choose to run for president in 1928. It's such a Coolidge thing to do. And after a moment, the reporters are sitting there reading this thing and trying to take it in. "I do not choose to run for president in 1928. And they're kind of looking at it, and Coolidge just blurts out to the reporters, he says, "If I take another term, I'll be in the White House until 1933. 10 years in Washington is longer than any other man's had, and it's too long." Then he kind of gets his breath and pulls his composure back together, and he says, "There will be no further statements from this office today." Such a classic Calvin Coolidge line. It's Calvin, Silent Cal at his most succinct and most awkward to do so. Yet, however, it's that business of America approach that really makes the Roaring Twenties roar together. And it's a fascinating story, and I can't wait to tell you about it. Make sure you like and subscribe. God bless you.